Hi, my name is Ben Hoffman. I'm an industrial designer and an avid Blender user. I've been using Blender since about 2.4, so that's about 10 years now. And if you dig around on this channel, you'll find some old Blender visual effects tutorials. There seems to be an increased interest in Blender for industrial design, and I figure it's about time to publish some tutorials and tips and tricks in order to help out anyone trying to make a jump from keyshot to Blender. Blender is an insanely powerful and feature-rich software. That being said, it's not entirely intended to use in the way that we use keyshot. So a lot of the tutorials out there for Blender aren't entirely applicable for us. That's why I'm creating this series. So this tutorial will be a brief introduction to Blender. I'll give an overview of some of the user interface, and then I'll show you how to import and set up a model from a CAD package. I plan on following up this tutorial with a series of videos getting more in depth with each of these aspects of the process. But if there's any area where you get hung up, please feel free to comment below with questions and I'll do my best to help out. So to get started, I'm going to give you an overview of what we're going to be creating today. I'm going to come out and say that importing models into Blender is one of the Achilles heels it has for what we want to do with it. Because of that, I created this quick little abomination I like to call the iStick. It's your Apple TV companion in these trying times. And I made it as a demo of a typical consumer electronic product that you might be rendering. I'll go ahead and link the project files in the video description below so you can go ahead and follow along. I'm going to follow up in a later video giving recommendations on how to export meshes from different CAD packages. But I figured for the purposes of getting you oriented with Blender that I'd provide a model for this first tutorial. So we're going to start this off with a fresh Blender scene. I'm going to go over some of the user interface and then some settings to enable. I plan on covering the user interface in a much more in-depth way. So in the meantime, I'd recommend you go over to the Blender YouTube channel and check out some of their Blender fundamental videos to get more oriented with like the bare bones of the software. That being said, we can get started. So if you click past this splash screen, you're greeted with the default Blender scene, a cube, a camera, and a light. One thing to remember about Blender is that the viewport is not the camera. So when you render what the camera sees, not what you're looking through the viewport at. You'll also notice that we're not looking at a render preview currently. And that's because Blender has a few different shading modes that the viewport can display. The first of those is a wireframe, then a solid view, what we're looking at now, and a rendered view, which renders it as the camera will see it, and then a material preview, which gives you I guess what you can think of as Keyshot's fast render setting. In order to switch between those, you can press Z, and then you get this pie menu, and you just go to the one you want and release Z. So next I'm going to go over some of the keyboard shortcuts I'm going to be using for this tutorial. You can follow along down here, and it'll give you a preview of exactly what I'm pressing. So to move, rotate, and scale, Blender has some pretty easy shortcuts to remember. That's S for scale, R for rotate, and G for grab. Now, if you want to limit that along one of the axes, which I'm going to be doing a lot, you just press Z for Z, X for X, and Y for Y. And then if you want to revert back to the home position of the object, you just hit Alt, and then whatever it is. So R for rotation, G for the move, and S for scale. Now, Blender has many uses, from visual effects to sculpting, texture painting, modeling, but what we're going to use it for in this tutorial is purely rendering. And the Blender developers have conveniently put in a few different workspaces at the top of here that we can click through. Right now we're in the layout, so it's sort of like Blender's default user interface. And the only other one we're going to be looking at today would be the shading workspace, and I'll talk more about that later. And I almost forgot, one of the most important things we're going to be doing in this program is tumbling. So the tumble view is middle mouse button. So before we go any further, I'm going to have you enable some settings. So if we go up to Edit and Preferences, the first one I'm going to have you enable is if you don't have a full number keyboard on the right-hand side of your keyboard, go to Input and Emulate Number Pad. So what that does is it lets us control the viewport with the numbers above our keyboard. I'm going to give you a little preview of that. So like 1 for front view, you can toggle between orthographic and perspective with 5, and then the other ones give you various different views. All right, now back to the settings. I'm going to get into this in more detail with another video, but if you have a graphics card that is decent enough, you can go ahead and enable it here. That's if you have an NVIDIA card, enable CUDA, and I always enable the CPU, so you're rendering with both the GPU and the CPU. If you have a ray tracing RTX card, you can enable optics, and if you have a AMD card, go ahead and enable OpenCL. Now, most of you Mac users will probably have an AMD chip, so you go ahead and enable OpenCL, and the rest of you, you're gonna have to figure out on your own. And if you have no clue, don't worry, I'm gonna publish another video explaining all of this. All right, sorry for dragging you through all of that. Now we're actually ready to get started, start editing some of the settings and importing the geometry. The first thing I want you to do is go ahead to this panel over here and click on the first setting. And so those are like kind of the general scene settings or the general project settings. And I'm going to go ahead and have you switch the render engine from Eevee to Cycles. Now Blender ships with 2 render engines, and that's what you just saw there, Eevee and Cycles. Cycles is closer to keyshot. It's made for making photorealistic renders. Eevee is based off of a game engine made for real-time renders, and it can be incredibly fast and actually pretty photorealistic, but requires a little bit more tweaking and settings in order to get right. So just take my word for it, Cycles will be an easier starting point for getting an image out of Blender. While we're here, go ahead and enable GPU compute if you just enabled the GPU in the settings earlier. Next step is we're going to hit X and delete everything. And we're going to be building the scene from scratch. Next, we're going to import our geometry. Go ahead and hit File, Import, FBX. So the file I provided you is an FBX, and if you're exporting your own mesh from your CAD package, I'd recommend an FBX if your CAD package supports it. So I'm going to go navigate to where I have that saved and import it. Now you'll notice it's absolutely tiny, and that's because Blender's default size that it likes dealing with is 1 meter, not a millimeter. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to scale it up by a factor of 100 to get it into the sort of size that Blender likes dealing with. Otherwise, we're going to run into issues down the line, and this just is a little bit easier. In order to correct the scaling, we're going to go ahead and take a look at exactly what size the actual object is at now, and you do that by expanding that side menu. You can also do that by pressing in, and then go ahead and select that outer edge, and then go to the item view up here in that side panel. And we get an idea for exactly what size it is. It's saying it's 5 meters by 0.7 meters by 20 meters. Now, that's not right at all, so we're going to go and click on the scene settings, hit units, make sure we're working in metrics, then set the unit to millimeters, and now we're going to want to scale to get back into the right unit. I recommend doing this because when we start designing the materials, different settings will be in the right scale. So in this case, I believe it's by 1/100th, and now we're into the right ballpark. So that's 50 millimeters by 7 millimeters by 200 millimeters. Now our grid just got absolutely enormous. What we're going to do is click this little drop down here and set the same scaling factor for the grid. That's just going to bump that back up. Now I'm going to go ahead and get this oriented how I want it. So we can hit 1 to hit that to get into that front view, R to rotate, and X along the x-axis. And I have to know it's negative 90 degrees in order to get to where we want. I'm going to go ahead and raise it so it's sitting at Z0, 4 millimeters along Z. Hit enter, and now we're oriented how we want it. We just need to save that orientation. So if you make sure you hit A to select everything, and then hit Control A, apply all transformations. And that just lets us save that as the home position. So if we move it, we can just bring it back with Alt. Now, if you take a look over here at the right-hand side, this is sort of like Blender's layers, similar to Photoshop. You can go and collapse that. Everything is grouped into collections, so you can add more collections and think of those as like layer groups in Photoshop. Now you'll notice over here that everything's on its own and it's kind of a pain in the butt to select everything. And once we have more geometry in the scene, we can't just hit A to select everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a empty. And an empty in Blender is just geometry that is visible in the viewport but doesn't show up in render. So to do that, we're just going to hit Shift A and select an empty here. You can use whatever you want. I'm going to use a circle. And then instead of scaling it using S, we're going to come over here into the side panel. It should already be selected, and just type in the size we want. I found that 120 millimeters works really well for this. And then I'm going to go ahead and rotate it around X and then 90. Doing that lets us affect the size of it in the viewport without changing the scale of the actual object. Now go ahead and select any part of that geometry, hit A to select everything, hold Shift, and then select that empty again. You see that there's two different selection colors, and what that means is the empty that we just selected is the primary selection, which matters when, in this next step when we hit Control and P to parent it. It parents it to the primary selection, which is what we want, the empty in this case. Go ahead and just select Object. Now if we select that empty, we can just move it around, and that just gives us a really easy way to select the object. You'll also notice that over here in the layer view that everything is tucked underneath that empty, and you can go ahead and rename that now like model. With all of that setup out of the way, now we're ready to start designing the materials. So in this view, if you select an object, you can take a look at the material that's applied to it over here, but where Blender really shines is what Keyshot calls the material graph. Blender has a very robust node system. So if you hop on over to the shading workspace, you get a preview of exactly what that looks like. In this workspace, we have the nodes for the material down here, viewport up here, a preview of any texture we bring in, and then a file browser, and then the same sort of panels that we had in the previous viewport over there. Right now, the shading workspace defaults to the preview render, which is fine for what we're doing. So let's dive in and start actually designing our materials. By default, Blender populates everything with this principal shader, which is basically one shader that handles pretty much anything you're going to run into, and it's really flexible and something that I personally use for the majority of my materials. This is most similar to Keyshot's generic shader they just added in Keyshot 9, I believe. At any rate, what you get here is basically a whole bunch of sliders that control all aspects of the material, like how metallic it is. For what we do, we'll just use that as a binary, either 1 for metal or 0 for plastics. Specular, so that's how bright that reflection is in the plastics. Roughness, similar to Keyshot, just how rough the material, how rough that reflection is. And then you have inputs for the bump mapping underneath the normal. And then the rest of it we can get into at a later date, but isn't really necessary for this tutorial. By default, when Blender imports FBXs, they import with this normal map node. You can just press X to delete that. It's not entirely necessary. So right now, we're working on the exterior part of this remote. So that's just going to go ahead and be like an anodized aluminum. And what we're going to do is just make sure that it is set to 100% metal. I'm going to lower the roughness to 0.3. You'll find that the roughness values don't really line up exactly with Keyshot. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a bump for it. So how I like working in this workspace is by hitting Shift and A and searching instead of like going through the different panels and grabbing exactly what I want. Now, I'll explain a lot of these at a later date, but for what we're doing, just go ahead and search noise. Now, in order to easily preview this, I'm going to have you enable another add-on. So go ahead and go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then search Node Wrangler. And what that lets us do once you enable it is hold Shift and Control, and then click on any node, and you get a preview of that output. So you can see here that our noise seems to be stretched a bit. and that's not exactly what we want. So we need to tell Blender exactly what sort of mapping we want to use, similar to what we do in keyshot. So if you hit Shift and A, search for texture coordinate, and then select object from that. Again, I can get into detail with all of these at a later date. So now we get a lot more of a uniform distribution of that noise. And then I'm just going to scale it down so it's more of like a bump for this metal. Maybe a little bit more. And then in order to turn that into the actual like bump map, we're going to search for the bump node. And then drag the factor to the height. What that does is it changes this color data into bump data. And now the bump height, when we preview it, is a little bit high. It's at 1, so that's 1 millimeter. We're going to knock that back to something a little bit more reasonable there. And once we plug it in to the normal, we can hit Shift to Control to see that node there. And it's going to take a second to update in the viewport. Now, like I said, this is the material preview, sort of like the fast render. If we go over to render by hitting Z, we'll notice that it's gray, and that's because there's no lights in the scene. So if we hit Shift A up here and select a light, I'm going to recommend area. And again, we can dive into what each of those light options are at a later date. We're going to add a area light. So that's just one massive square. That's all emissive. Right now the power is a little bit low. So just type in 1 there and it's going to bump it to 1 watt. Blender recently changed this over from an arbitrary number to watts. Don't ask me why. You can go manipulate all of this in the viewport by clicking on the border of the light. And then I'm just going to use the grab command next to move it off to the side, R to rotate it, and we get a little bit of idea of exactly what we're looking at. Now we'll get more in depth with the lighting after we finish the materials, but that's looking pretty nice. Maybe we select that again, make it more of a space gray, bring it down a bit, put a little blue purple in it, just a hair. That's a little bit too much. I like having my my color selection be hue, saturation, and value because it's easy to change how saturated and how dark the material is. We're going to run with that for right now. Next, we're just going to recycle that node for this chamfer detail here. So select that node, hit Control-C, then we're going to select that green material there. Delete that node, Control-V to paste it, and then I'm going to plug it in like that, and reduce the roughness to make it a glossy material. Now we have a nice little glossiness happening there. Next, we're going to focus on the actual display. I've exported this with 2 different objects for the display. So that's the glass, and then underneath it, a screen material. So first we're going to look at the screen. So select that top glass material, hit H to hide it, and then we can access that screen material here. What I'm going to ask you to do is go ahead and hop on over to your favorite search engine and find a nice screenshot from a phone you like. Go ahead and download that, and then you can drag that in from your file browser, like so. And then if we Shift and Control, click on it, we can see a preview. And it's tiling, which isn't exactly what we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit the UV of this object. And UV editing is something that Blender does really well, and it might sound pretty complicated, but it's a pretty simple process. What we're going to do is we're going to hit Tab to hop on over to the edit mode of this object. So under normal circumstances in Blender, this would be like how you model an object. You can like control the vertices and move it around, but that's not what we want to do. We just want to edit the UV, which we can also do from this edit mode. So if we hit A to select everything in the edit mode, and then come down over to here and select UV editor. we get a preview of how that geometry is being projected into 2D space and mapped onto this image. So you can see it's entirely too large. So we're just going to select everything with A over here, scale it down, move it over, and it looks like there's a bit of stretching going on, so I'm going to make that match what it looks like in the viewport about there. Look for the icons to start looking like they're the correct proportion. All right, and it's not perfect, but there we go. I'm going to dive deeper into exactly like how to do this sort of label operation in future videos, but for now that works. And then we also want this material to be emissive. So we can do that through this principal shader, but we might as well just use the basic one. So search for emission shader, like that. And then drop it in there, Control click to preview it, and then maybe make it a little bit brighter. All right, now we're ready to work on the actual glass material. So I'm gonna hit Alt and H to unhide that. And then I'm going to select the glass. Go ahead and delete that normal node right there. Now we can use this shader to make glass by upping the transmission and turning off how metallic it is, but it doesn't give us much control, and it tries to simulate like an actual slab of glass on top of that emission shader, which can introduce like artifacting and strange things at render time and increase render time. So what we're going to do here is we're actually just going to fake having glass there by mixing between a transparent shader and a glossy shader. So we're just going to pull those up. Transparent, make sure you don't select translucent. If we take a preview, it's exactly what it says it is. And then we're going to search for glossy. Look at that. And then turn off the roughness. Now you'll notice that it's just reflecting that light, and then the background happens to be by default gray. At a later date I can show how to add HDRs. In this case we don't need to worry about that because we're going to light the scene with entirely physical lights. The next thing we're going to do is mix between these two shaders with a mix shader, and then I'm going to have you search layer, weight, and we're going to use this node as the factor to mix between these two shaders here. So if we take a preview of not the Fresnel, but click again to the facing, and then take a look at it in the viewport, we see that it switches between white and black depending on the angle of your view. That's going to give a pretty nice approximation of how reflective glass is at different viewing angles. So go ahead and take facing and plug it into the factor input, and then we can preview that there. And this also lets us easily control how much of the reflection we see at any given time. I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0.5. And it looks like as we tumble this around that we have the inputs reversed. So we're just going to go switch those. And now we're getting something similar to what we want. And we can just go ahead and delete that principal shader for now. All right, the next material we're going to tackle is this gasket material between that aluminum and the glass. Just go ahead and hide those so it's easy to select, and then select it. We're just going to make it a simple diffuse material that's like a little bit darker. It's not a metal, so we're going to take the metallic down, and we're just going to leave it being that rough. You don't really see much of it, but it's going to catch a little highlight. Alt-H to unhide those. And then the last material we have to deal with is this little mesh material on the speakers. Don't ask me why this has speakers, but I threw this in as a way to demonstrate another mode of mapping images on textures. So with that selected, go ahead and navigate to the project files I gave you, and then you're going to drag in the alpha and the bump material I gave you for this mesh. So we're looking to make a material that looks like a mesh guard for these speaker holes. So we're going to take that alpha texture, and we're going to plug it into alpha of the actual shader there and preview the shader. Now it's kind of hard to get an idea of exactly what we're doing here in the viewport, so in order to not have our computer melt, we might as well set that to material preview while we take a look at the preview over here. So you can see that's inverted from what we want. So what we're going to do is we're just going to search for invert and slap that in between, and now we have the effect we're going for the alpha. The next texture I gave you was the bump. You can take a look at that here. We're just going to do something similar to that first material by searching bump and then plugging that black and white height bump map into the height of the bump node. And then we get a little preview here. Again, 1 millimeter seems a little bit overkill, so maybe 0.01 will do the trick. Plug that into the normal node down here, and you can go ahead and delete the normal map. And then you get a preview there. Now, if we look at it in the viewport, we're seeing this tearing, and that's because I was lazy and I didn't make a seamless texture. So we're going to have to adjust where this texture is mapping. In this case, we can just use the texture coordinate node and the mapping node. Take the UV map of the object, plug it into vector, and then select the vector output of this and plug it into the two textures. Now what we can do is we can use the mapping node to adjust where the texture is. So maybe move it down in Y to get away from that seam, and then we can select through all of those and then scale it maybe by 2. It's looking pretty decent, and then we don't want this to be copper looking material, so we're just going to reduce the texture there, or reduce the saturation. Bring that down, and there we go. Let's take a look at it in the render preview. Looks like we're going to need another light here to see what's happening. So I'm just going to select that light, hit Shift and D to duplicate it. I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees and just grab it and bring it over here. So a nice thing about Blender is if you double tap a specific axis, you rotate locally around that axis, not globally. So you can see the difference here with rotating along the global Z and then the local Z. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this up here and take a look at that. All right, that will do. It's probably a detail you'll never see, but it's something that's kind of nice. All right, now the final thing to finish this all off is to add a little logo. So go ahead over to your search engine and find a nice logo to use, or maybe make your own. Go ahead and try and download a PNG. That makes life a little bit easier. Now we're going to use another add-on here called Images as Planes. So go to Edit, Preferences, Images as Planes. So what that lets us do is it lets us import an image as geometry to render. And I found that that's like a nice way to put logos and labels onto flat objects. So this is another option for you to add a label. So in order to import our image, go to File, Import, Images as Planes, and then navigate to wherever you put that. All right, so imported right there. We're going to go ahead and scale it. And then that's backwards, so I'm going to go ahead and scale, and rotate around Y, 180 degrees. Now you'll see that it's intersecting a bit with the geometry. So we're just going to grab it and just move it slightly above the geometry. And you can hold Shift to do fine adjustments. Back to render view. Now we don't really care to take the color of this because we can just use the alpha as a stencil, but I do want to make it metallic with pretty minimal roughness. That way we can get that nice highlight when we look at it in the light. All right, and then the last step is to select that bottom object to parent the logo to. That way when we move it, it moves. And I'm just going to move that up and Y, make it a little bit offset, similar to an iPhone. All right, now we're ready to set up our scene for rendering. I'm going to go back over to the layout side to get a little bit larger of a viewport for manipulating the 3D objects. To start off with, I'm going to add in a plane that we can use for the background. To do that, we're just going to search Shift-A, add plane, just scale that up a bit. And we're going to turn that into a sweep by hitting Edit Mode. You can go ahead and select Edge up here. We're going to select that far edge, hit E to extrude it up. And you have just done your first bit of modeling in Blender. In order to fillet that background, or that back edge, we're going to use a modifier. So modifiers are things you can add to each object in Blender that doesn't affect the underlying geometry. In this case, we're just going to add a bevel, which is Blender's way of filleting. Then we're going to change how many segments to make it smooth and increase the offset. All right. And in order to ensure that that's fully smooth, we're going to hit F3 and search for Shade Smooth. Now, what that does is, if I disable that and change how many segments back to a lower number, shading it smooth is kind of like a hack that the program runs in order to make it look like it's smooth, even though the underlying geometry is not. We're going to increase the steps though, so it renders nicely. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to give this guy a little buddy to float along with him. In order to do that, let's go ahead and move everything that is not the model out of this collection by selecting them, hitting M, and then we're going to make a new collection for them to sit in. And then now up here on that first collection, all we have is that original model. So what we're going to do, what that lets us do is easily duplicate our object. And what we're going to do is select Duplicate Linked with the right click. And the difference between duplicate collection and duplicate linked is that whatever edits we make to this geometry will be translated into the second one. So you can go ahead and select one of the two, move it to the side, and then we're going to start organizing the scene. So I'm going to select both of them over here and bring them up a little bit, Z, so that they're floating. You know, it's always nice to have a little floating product shot. I'm going to tilt it a bit. A nice thing you can do is rotate along the individual origins. So because we have each of them selected individually, we can then rotate across the individual origins. So I'm going to do individual Z, so it's like tilted a bit. And then, so on this one back here, flipped over. So I'm going to go find the proper axis for that. Again, by double tapping to find the local axis, and then do 180. Let's take a look. It's great. I want this one upright, so. $180. I'm just gonna make a nice little composition. All right. So let's go ahead and give that background plane a dark reflective texture because we're not doing much with the like designing the material for this background plane. We can just kind of do that here by changing the base color, bringing it down, and then maybe decrease the roughness so it's reflecting more. I find moving around the Blender lights to be a little bit cumbersome, so you can definitely continue this tutorial adding lights and positioning them how you want, but I'm going to make a recommendation for another plugin. This one you actually have to go ahead and download, so I'm going to put the link in the description, but head on over to leomoon.com and take a look at the Blender lighting studio that he released. So basically it tries to bring the keyshot HDR editor into Blender. So you can go ahead and download that. It's going to download as a zip, go into preferences, and then install, and then you don't need to unzip it. You can just install by selecting that zip, and then you should be able to pull up the Light Studio and enable it. That adds another tab over onto this side menu here. You can just select that, and then if you're in the render view, sorry, the screencast menu selected, that's what's bringing you the little mouse and keys down there so you can follow along. You want the Light Studio. Hit Create Light Studio. We're going to go ahead and select background setup. This is just going to make the background dark instead of that gray. And then hit the control panel. And that's going to pop up this HDR editor here for us. And then hit Add a Light. And you're going to see that adds a physical mesh-based light into the scene. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is that you can't actually use it with Eevee because Eevee doesn't support mesh-based lights, but it works perfectly for cycles, so that's why I'm recommending it here. We're going to go delete those lights we made previously. I'm going to switch on over to the other view so I can see it, and then back to render preview. And then you can start designing the lights. Now, the other important thing we need to actually render something here is a camera. So, like I mentioned earlier, Blender does not render from the viewport, it renders from the camera view. So you're gonna hit Shift A, camera, grab it up in Z so we just know where it is. Now, if you hit Control and 0 while you're holding it, that's gonna, or while you have it selected, that's gonna set it as the active camera. And then after that, we can always just hit 0 to snap back into the camera view. So another interesting keyboard command you can do here is hit Shift and the tilde key. So it's the one right under Escape. And then you can start to navigate the camera as if it were a video game, which is a pretty nice and I find intuitive way to position the camera where I want it. And in order to make it more fine of a movement, you can just take your middle mouse button and scroll down to move slower. All right, I'm going to move it out here so I can then select a longer focal length. So if the tab's not already selected, you can select the camera tab here. I'm going to set it to a 200mm lens because I like doing product shots from longer focal length. I find that's what a lot of the product photographers use. And I want to mimic that in order to boost my realism. And I'm going to position in a sort of dynamic way here. All right, let's take a look. So I'm going to start by giving this a little backlight, again with the camera view. In order to take some stress off of your computer, if you hit Control and B, you can select a region that it starts to render in. I just select the whole entire camera region, but that way it's not rendering outside of it like it was previously. All right. So I'm going to scale that up to get a better idea of where it is. I'm going to give these both a more dynamic angle by selecting them. And the rest of this is all to your own preference. So go ahead and encourage you to make a scene however you see fit, whatever you think is the best rendition of this beautiful eye stick. But you can never go wrong with backlighting. All right, so that's going to give a nice little gradient on the logo. I'm going to add another light. This time we're going to use the 3D edit box here. So similar to placing a highlight in keyshot, you can just select on the geometry exactly what you want to have highlighted. And then once you're happy with it, you hit enter. I'm going to scale this up, maybe hit it again. I'm going to find that edge. I'm going to also place a highlight on this edge to get definition. Maybe this time reduce how bright it is. Now I'm getting a highlight up there that I don't like. One nice thing about this is there's a few different hotkeys that this lets you do. One of them is isolating a light with right click. So I'm going to figure out which light is giving me that. It's that backlight. So maybe lower it here so we don't have to worry about it. Just dismiss the dialog. And then you can just double click to re-enable it. I'm going to add one more as a highlight over this glass. All right, so we have a ballpark for that. I'm going to scale it up. Then I'm going to use this masking option to find the, looks like we want to go the other way. Oh, there we go. So we have a nice dynamic highlight. All right, and then just reduce the intensity on that so it's not blowing out the render too hard. There you have it. You can keep on tweaking it how you like. I'm just going to recommend some render settings to make sure you get a nice fast render. So we can actually lower the samples here in the scene because there's nothing too complex about it. I'll publish a tutorial in the future kind of explaining some of these in more detail, but for the time being, just set it at 32. And you can increase it if you find that the render is a little bit too grainy. We're going to extend this lighting panel and then set it to limited global illumination. That's just going to reduce the number of bounces the light is taking. Again, something I can explain in depth in the future. Just take my word for it for this one. A new feature to the latest release of Blender is adaptive sampling, which is just going to increase the samples on more complicated areas of the geometry and then reduce it, say, in this like black area where it doesn't actually need too many samples. And then you can set the resolution you want here in this panel. But when you're ready to render, you can just come over here and hit render or F12. So the render time is going to be dependent on the hardware you have, depending on whether or not you're rendering with only your GPU or your CPU or both. You might see like a single tile at a time versus multiple. But unfortunately, Blender doesn't have an option to select the amount of time you want to render for and just click go. You have to enter in settings that approximate the render time you want. In this case, it only took 25 seconds, and you'll find that it's probably a little bit grainy, so we can up the samples to reduce the grain. The other option you have for rendering is to come over to the render panel, open up performance, and then select progressive refine. And what that does when we hit render is it renders everything at once and it slowly reses up. So if you're not entirely sure how many samples it's going to take, that might be the way you want to go. It's a little bit less efficient than rendering each of the tiles a single time, which is why Blender opts for rendering tiles over this as default. So when it's done, you can hit escape, and then you can hit save as, and then save it wherever you want. I recommend saving as PNG at a color depth of 16, which just saves a little bit more data per pixel. So if you're editing in Photoshop, you don't get that banding. But yeah, after that, you're good to go. If you dismiss that render window, you can always go over to rendering and see a version of it there, and again, go to save. I'd like to see you take your own creative spin on this, maybe different CMS. Maybe you model something, an attachment that Apple could mark up and sell for $100. Who knows? If you want, you can post it to Instagram and tag Blender4ID. If enough people do that, I might put together a little critique video. But in the meantime, you can subscribe here on YouTube, and if you want, you can follow me over on Instagram at benhoffman.design. Thanks for sitting through this. I hope it opens a whole new world of opportunities for your design visualizations.